Do you want muscular forearms? Or maybe strong wrists that you can handle heavy pressing, dips, or maybe handstands? Or maybe you're trying to prepare for a season in a sport involving a lot of wrist and forearm strength, like tennis or golf. It doesn't matter why you're here. You're in the right place to figure out some information that you might not know about training this part of your body. In this video, I will cover notoriously undertrained tissues of the wrist and forearms. I'll break down and explain the biomechanics and physiology of these tissues. I'll give theoretical examples of how to periodize this training so that you can maximize your intended results. And then at the end, I'll fly through a number of quick variations to help you start thinking creatively on how you can incorporate this type of training for your specific goals. Now, you're probably comfortable with or have in some way trained before wrist flexion and extension. Now, these are pretty common ways to have trained your forearms or wrists before in the past, and you've likely either done or seen people experiment with these types of movements in the gym before. Something like simple dumbbell wrist curls will train the wrist flexors, while something like overhand dumbbell curls will isometrically train the wrist extensors. Now, conversely, a range that's really never trained outside of physical therapy scenarios is wrist deviation. This isn't flexion or extension. This is actually deviating the wrist inward and outward. Now, this is as fundamental a movement to the wrist as rotation, flexion, and extension is to the elbow. And the fact that this is not largely trained and might specifically not be trained by you is reason to be very excited, because that means there's a lot of beginner gains to be made in this area. Now, let's go ahead and define a few of the parameters that we'll be using to describe this exercise. We have the downward deviation of the wrist, which will place these muscles running alongside the top of my forearm in a lengthened position. This would be end long range. Now, contrasting that, as I turn up my wrist, which is a much smaller range of motion up here, I am shortening the same musculature, and this would be end short range, mid range being anything that falls between those two end ranges. Now, to make all of that a little bit simpler and clearer, let's hop into the actual exercise I'll be demoing itself. I call these kettlebell wrist deviations because by using a kettlebell, I'm able to extend the moment lever of the load past where the wrist is at. And so here you can see that I'm doing the same wrist deviation movement that I showed before, but you can see that by weighting with the actual weight end further out from my wrist, I'm creating a longer curve past the fulcrum, which is my wrist. Here I am shortening my elbow angle to create an even shorter short end range, much similar to why you would use something like a preacher or a spider curl. And then conversely, this would be the extra long end range, whereby extending my arm, I'm getting even greater stretch at the end range of motion. I want to quickly make sure to give you some actionable steps to start implementing this type of movement into your own training. And now a lot of these concepts that I'm going to apply towards the periodization of this movement is covered in two separate tendon videos that I've made on this channel before. So if you're curious about any of my specific reasonings behind what I'm about to say, you might want to check out those videos as well. Now, specifically with this movement, because it's largely untrained in the vast majority of individuals, I really like to start in the mid-range, both at the elbow and the wrist. Now, for the more scientifically astute of you, you might be having red flags going off saying, but I thought training in the end range of motion can grant sometimes superior growth in hypertrophy for the muscle and even strength in that position. And to that, I would say, yeah, you're totally correct. But the risk of injury training at end ranges of motion also increase. And as this is likely going to be an entry into training wrist deviation for most people, starting in mid-range is the safest and easiest way to get into training this movement. I am also a very big fan of using isometrics. So I would really recommend starting with some mid-range isometric training, wrist deviation, using the kettlebell, of course. What this is going to do is it's going to improve tendon tissue quality through the wrist and forearm. It'll also raise work capacity of these muscles and systems, as well as improving your neuromuscular connection to the actual tissues. Have you ever thought back to the first time you tried to flex a muscle that you weren't really comfortable with, and your mind's kind of just twitching out, trying to figure out how to squeeze the muscle? It's the same idea with this. It's largely untrained tissues. The idea of flexing the musculature in your actual wrist and forearm might be very foreign to you, and taking the time to spend a few weeks doing this base style of training can really help improve that mind-muscle connection. Now, following a few weeks block, perhaps, of this isometric holds in the mid-range, I would experiment with doing some eccentric loading, where all we're doing is controlling the slow lowering of the weight. You can reach right around with your hand, help the kettlebell back up into the top position, and then just slowly control the lowering of the weight into the long end range of motion. This is once again really great for tendon quality, and it will help start being able to load heavier. You can pick heavier weights to lower than you can raise, and so this will help start get you experience with lifting more weights through wrist deviation. And then finally, as the third step in this mini periodization, I would recommend moving into fully dynamic movement involving the negative and positive, or eccentric and concentric portions of the lift. This can be programmed to whatever your specific goals are. So if you're really concerned about building muscle mass, program it in the same intensity RPE, RIR, rep range as you would for any other muscle building activity. I hope this gives you a quick summary idea of what my thoughts are when starting to incorporate this new movement into your training. So, have you trained wrist deviation before? Are you maybe interested in training it now? Let me know down in the comments below, and I'll make sure to answer every single one of them. I hope you truly learned something new in the video today, and hopefully, if this is new, you have a lot of beginner gains standing in front of you ready to be grabbed. Thanks for watching the video today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good one.